The flames took everything in less than an hour, and Jedediah Quinn stood frozen in the road watching 30 years of his father's work collapse into glowing embers, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but watch his entire world turn to ash before his eyes. "No," he said, the word tearing out of his throat like something ripped from flesh. "No, no, no." The forge had stood at the edge of Prescott Valley since before the war, a monument to iron and fire, and the sweat of 2 generations of Quinn men. Now the roof timbers cracked and screamed as they gave way, sending a plume of sparks into the black Arizona sky like a funeral for everything he had ever known. Behind him, he heard the shouts of the men who had done this. Silas Rourke's men, sent to send a message: pay the debt or lose everything. Jedediah had refused to sign over his land to Rourke's mining syndicate, and this was Rourke's answer, delivered in flame and smoke while Jedediah had been 3 miles away helping a neighbor with a lame horse. He fell to his knees in the dirt, ash raining down around him like black snow, and for the first time since his father had died, Jedediah Quinn wept. It was Theresa Ramsey who found him there an hour later, when the flames had died to embers and the smoke had begun to clear enough to see the skeletal ribs of the forge building standing black against the stars. She had ridden hard from her homestead 2 miles distant, drawn by the glow on the horizon and a dread she could not name, and what she found broke something loose in her chest that she had not expected. Jedediah. She dropped from her horse without bothering to tie it, running to where he knelt in the wreckage. "Jedediah, look at me." He did not look at her. His hands were black with soot, his face streaked where tears had cut through the grime, and he stared at the ruins of his father's forge like a man staring into his own grave. "It is gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Everything my father built, everything I was going to build, gone." Theresa knelt beside him in the dirt, careless of her skirts, and took his ruined hands in her own steady ones. She was not a woman given to soft words or false comfort, but she understood loss, understood it in her bones from a life that had taught her hard lessons early, and she would not let this man drown in it alone. "It is not everything," she said fiercely. "You are still here. Your hands still work. Your mind still works. That forge was built once from nothing, Jedediah Quinn, and it can be built again." He turned to look at her then, and even through his grief, something in her voice caught his attention, some iron certainty that did not match the soft sympathy he expected from a neighbor woman come to offer condolences. "You do not understand," he said. "Rourke did this. He will not stop until I am ruined and gone from this valley, until my land belongs to his company like everything else does." "Then we will not let him win," Theresa said simply, as though the matter were already decided, and something about the absolute confidence in her voice made Jedediah Quinn, for just a moment, believe her. To understand how Theresa Ramsey came to be kneeling in the ashes of a stranger's ruined life, one must go back 3 years, to the spring of 1878, when she had arrived in Prescott Valley with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and a determination that had already survived more than most women twice her age would ever face. She had come from Missouri, though she rarely spoke of it, and the story she gave when pressed was thin enough that anyone paying attention could tell there were pieces missing. "A husband dead of fever," she said, though the way her jaw tightened when she said it suggested there was more to that tale than fever. "A homestead claim filed in her own name, which raised eyebrows across the valley, since a widow filing her own claim was unusual enough. But a widow who then proceeded to work that claim entirely by herself, without hired hands or a new husband to do the heavy work, was practically scandalous. But Theresa Ramsey did not care what the valley thought of her. She had learned carpentry from her father, a shipwright who had insisted his daughter learn every trade he knew despite what the neighbors said about a girl handling tools meant for men. She had learned to read plans and cut joints and raise timber frames before she had learned to sew a proper seam, and when her father died and left her nothing but his tools and his stubbornness, she had used both to build a life for herself that owed nothing to any man. The homestead she built with her own hands was the talk of the valley for reasons beyond her gender. The cabin was tight and true, its corners perfectly square, its roof pitched at an angle that shed snow without collapsing under its weight. The barn she raised the following year was even more impressive, a testament to joinery that old-timers came from miles around to inspect, shaking their heads in wonder that a woman's hands had cut those mortise and tenon joints, had raised those beams true and plumb without a single nail where wooden pegs would serve better. She kept goats and chickens and a small herd of cattle, and she sold eggs and milk at the general store in town, and slowly, methodically, she had built herself a life that needed no one else to sustain it. She had told herself that was enough. She had told herself, in the quiet hours after dark when the loneliness crept in despite her best efforts to keep it at bay, that independence was its own reward, that she needed no man's protection or provision, that the wounds of her past marriage had taught her that trusting a man with her heart was a fool's errand she would never repeat. She had seen Jedediah Quinn around the valley, of course. Everyone knew the blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man with hands like iron and a quiet way about him that spoke of grief carried privately. His father had died 2 years past, leaving him the forge and little else, and Jedediah had thrown himself into the work with a dedication that bordered on obsession, as though keeping the fires burning was the only way he knew to keep his father's memory alive. She had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in 3 years, mostly transactional. A hinge repaired, a plow blade sharpened, small courtesies exchanged with the careful distance of 2 people who had each built walls around themselves, for reasons the other did not know. But she had noticed him, in the way one notices a fixed point in a landscape, always there, always steady. And if she was honest with herself in those quiet, dark hours, she had noticed the way his forearms moved when he worked the bellows, the way his jaw set when he was concentrating, the way his rare smile transformed his whole face when something pleased him. She had told herself these were foolish observations, unworthy of a woman who had sworn off such foolishness forever. Then the forge had burned, and everything had changed. The morning after the fire, Prescott Valley buzzed with the news like a hive disturbed. Silas Rourke's mining syndicate had been pushing into the valley for 2 years, buying up land at prices designed to seem generous, until a man understood what Rourke intended to do with that land, once he owned enough of it to control the water rights that fed every farm and ranch for 20 miles. Jedediah Quinn's forge sat at a crucial junction, controlling access to the only reliable spring on that side of the valley, and Rourke had made it clear through increasingly less subtle channels that he intended to have that land, one way or another. Jedediah had refused 3 offers already, each one lower than the last as Rourke's patience wore thin, and now the 4th offer would surely come dressed in the ashes of everything Jedediah had built, a silent threat that said clearly enough what would happen to the rest of his life if he continued to refuse. Theresa found Jedediah at dawn, still sitting amid the ruins, having apparently not moved all night. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief, and when she approached leading her horse, he barely acknowledged her presence. "You should eat something," she said, setting down a basket she had brought from her own kitchen. "And you should sleep. Nothing gets solved by a man too tired to think straight." "I do not need your charity," Jedediah said, his voice rough with the particular bitterness of a proud man brought low. "I will manage this myself." Theresa's eyes narrowed, and something flinty entered her expression that made Jedediah look at her properly for the first time that morning. "This is not charity, Jedediah Quinn. This is what neighbors do for each other in this valley. Or did you forget that when you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself to notice the world around you?" The words hit harder than she perhaps intended, and Jedediah's head snapped up, anger flashing in his exhausted eyes. "You have no idea what I have lost. This forge was my father's life's work. It was going to be mine. Now Rourke has taken even that from me. He has taken a building, Theresa said, her voice hard as flint now. Buildings can be rebuilt. What he cannot take unless you let him is your skill, your knowledge, your hands. You are still a blacksmith, Jedediah, whether you have four walls around you or not. With what money? What materials? He has burned my tools along with everything else. Not everything, Theresa said, and something in her tone made him pay attention. I saw the anvil still standing when I rode past this morning. Cast iron does not burn so easily as wood. And I know a thing or two about rebuilding from nothing, Mr. Quinn. I have done it myself, alone, with far less help than you have available to you now. Jedediah stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time not just the quiet neighbor woman who sold eggs at the general store, but someone with steel in her spine that matched anything he had forged in his own furnace. What help would that be? Mine, Theresa said simply. I know carpentry better than most men in this valley, Mr. Quinn. I can help you rebuild these walls faster and stronger than you could manage alone. And I know something of standing against men like Rourke, who think money and muscle can bend everyone to their will. The offer hung in the smoke-tinged morning air between them, and Jedediah felt something shift inside his chest, some crack of possibility opening in the black despair that had consumed him through the long night. He did not yet know how much this woman would come to mean to him, did not yet understand that this moment, kneeling in the ashes of his old life, marked the beginning of something far more valuable than what he had lost. Why would you do this? He asked. Why would you risk Rourke's anger by helping me? Theresa's chin lifted, and something dangerous flashed in her dark eyes. Because men like Silas Rourke believe that money gives them the right to destroy other people's lives without consequence. I have seen that kind of thinking before, Mr. Quinn, and I have paid the price it exacts on those who stand alone against it. I will not stand by and watch it happen again if I have the power to prevent it. There was a story there, Jedediah could tell, some dark chapter in her past that explained the fierce protectiveness in her voice, but he did not press her for details. Instead, he simply nodded, extending a soot-blackened hand that she took without hesitation, sealing an agreement that would change both their lives forever. All right, Miss Ramsey, he said. Let us see what we can build from these ashes. The work began that very afternoon, and it was work unlike anything Jedediah had expected from a woman he had known only as a quiet homesteader keeping to herself at the edge of the valley. Theresa arrived with her own tools, a set of chisels and saws that showed the careful maintenance of someone who understood their proper use, and she set to work clearing the burned timber with an efficiency that left Jedediah standing back in surprise. You have done this before, he said, watching her expertly assess which of the fallen beams might be salvaged and which needed to be cleared entirely. More than once, she said, not looking up from her work. Grab that end. We need to move this beam before it settles further into the foundation stones. He grabbed the end she indicated, and together they hauled the massive timber clear, Theresa directing their movements with the confidence of someone who understood weight and leverage and the physics of construction in ways that impressed him despite his grief. By the second day, word had spread through the valley about the unusual partnership forming at the burned forge site, and opinions were sharply divided. Some folks, particularly the older women in town, clucked their tongues about the impropriety of an unmarried woman spending her days working alongside a bachelor blacksmith, regardless of the circumstances. Others, more practical-minded, simply marveled at how quickly the wreckage was being cleared and new foundations laid. Sheriff Amos Blackwood rode out on the third day, ostensibly to check on the fire's cause, though everyone in the valley knew perfectly well who was responsible, even if proving it in a court of law remained another matter entirely. Rourke's men were seen in the area that night, the sheriff said, watching Theresa direct the placement of a new foundation stone with the same authority she might have used commanding troops. Course, proving it is another matter. His hired hands have a way of disappearing when questions get asked. I do not need proof to know who did this, Jedediah said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. I need to rebuild, and I need Rourke to understand that burning my forge will not make me sell my land. That land controls water rights for half this valley, the sheriff said grimly. Rourke wants it bad enough to keep pushing, proof or no proof. You be careful, both of you. A man desperate enough to burn a forge might not stop there. The warning hung in the air after the sheriff rode away, and Theresa found Jedediah watching her with new concern in his eyes. You should reconsider helping me, he said. If Rourke is willing to burn my forge, he might not hesitate to threaten anyone who helps me rebuild it. I have faced worse threats than Silas Rourke, Theresa said, though something flickered behind her eyes that suggested those threats had left scars deeper than she let on. I am not going anywhere, Jedediah Quinn, not until this forge stands taller than it ever did before. Something in her fierce determination stirred admiration in Jedediah that went beyond simple gratitude for her help. He had known strong women in his life. His own mother had been no shrinking violet. But there was something different about Theresa Ramsey's strength, something that came not from necessity alone, but from a deliberate choice to be unbreakable in a world that had apparently tried very hard to break her. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its comfortable efficiency. Theresa arrived each morning before dawn, her wagon loaded with tools and supplies she had somehow procured, refusing to explain exactly how a homesteader woman managed to acquire quality lumber and hardware on such short notice. I have friends in town who owe me favors, was all she would say, deflecting further questions with the same steel efficiency she brought to every task. Jedediah, for his part, found himself watching her work with growing fascination that had little to do with gratitude for her assistance. There was something mesmerizing about the way she moved through the construction site, her calculations quick and precise, her hands steady on tools that most women in the valley would have found too heavy to lift, let alone use with the skill she demonstrated. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked one afternoon, watching her cut a mortise joint with precision that would have satisfied the most demanding master carpenter. Theresa paused, her chisel hovering over the wood, and for a moment Jedediah thought she might deflect the question as she had deflected so many others about her past. But something in his tone, perhaps the genuine curiosity rather than mere polite conversation, seemed to soften her guard slightly. "My father was a shipwright," she said, "back in Missouri before we came west. He built vessels for the river trade, and he insisted I learn everything he knew, despite what the neighbors thought about a girl handling a carpenter's tools. He used to say that skill has no gender, only the ignorance that tries to assign one. He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Theresa said, and something in her voice suggested grief still fresh despite the years that had passed. "He died when I was 19, and I thought I had lost everything that mattered. But he left me his tools and his knowledge, and those have served me better than any dowry could have." "And your husband?" Jedediah asked carefully, aware he was treading on delicate ground. "You mentioned he died of fever." The chisel in Theresa's hand went still, and when she looked up, something hard and cold had entered her eyes, extinguishing the warmth that had briefly flickered there while discussing her father. "That is not something I discuss," she said, her voice suddenly flat and final. "Some doors are better left closed, Mr. Quinn. I would appreciate you respecting that." Jedediah nodded, though the mystery of her past only deepened his fascination with this complicated, capable woman who had inserted herself so thoroughly into his life at its lowest point. He did not press further, but he could not help wondering what dark secret lay behind that careful facade, what pain had taught her to build walls as solid as any structure her hands might raise. The forge began to take shape slowly, its new walls rising stronger and better designed than the original structure had been. Theresa had insisted on improvements that Jedediah's father had never considered: a better ventilation system for the smoke, a more efficient layout for the workspace that would allow Jedediah to move between anvil and forge and tool storage with greater speed and less wasted motion. "You have thought about this carefully," Jedediah observed one evening as they reviewed the day's progress by lantern light. the skeleton of new walls rising against the darkening sky. "I think about everything carefully," Theresa said. "It is how I have survived, Mr. Quinn. Careful thought, careful planning, and never depending on anyone else to solve my problems for me. Yet here you are, helping to solve mine." Something softened in Theresa's expression, an almost imperceptible shift that Jedediah was learning to recognize as significant, given how rarely her guard slipped even that much. "Perhaps I am learning that some problems are better solved together than alone." The words hung between them with weight beyond their simple meaning, and for a moment, Jedediah felt something shift in his chest, some recognition that this partnership had become something more than mere practical assistance. He studied her face in the lantern light, the strong lines of her jaw, the intelligence that shone clear in her dark eyes, the strength that radiated from every line of her posture even now, exhausted after a long day of physical labor. "Theresa," he said, using her given name for the first time since their partnership began. "I want you to know how grateful I am for what you have done here. Not just the rebuilding, though that matters more than I can express. But you reminded me that I was not alone in this fight, that Rourke's fire had not extinguished everything worth fighting for." Theresa's cheeks colored slightly in the lantern light, an unusual show of vulnerability from a woman who had presented such steady confidence throughout their weeks of work together. "You are welcome, Jedediah. Though I confess, I have gained something from this partnership as well. I had forgotten what it felt like to work alongside someone who valued my skills rather than questioning them." Before either could explore the implications of that admission further, hoofbeats sounded on the road, and both turned to see 3 riders approaching in the fading light, their posture and pace suggesting trouble rather than friendly visiting. "Get behind me," Jedediah said instantly, his body tensing into a protective stance that Theresa found both endearing and faintly irritating, given her own capability to handle threats. "I can defend myself," she said, though she did not argue further as the riders drew closer, revealing themselves as 3 of Rourke's hired men, their faces hard with malicious intent. "Well, well," said the lead rider, a scarred man named Crawford who served as Rourke's chief enforcer. "Look what the blacksmith has been building. Seems the fire did not teach you the lesson it was meant to teach." "Get off my property," Jedediah said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no business here, mister." "Rourke wants to make a new offer," Crawford said, ignoring the demand. "More generous than the last given the circumstances. He thinks you might see reason now that you understand what stubbornness costs." "Tell Rourke his fire only made me more determined to stay," Jedediah said. "This land is not for sale now or ever." Crawford's eyes shifted to Theresa, a slow, assessing look that made Jedediah's fists clench with barely controlled fury. "And who is this?" "The blacksmith's new woman, come to help him rebuild." "Careful, ma'am. Association with stubborn men has a way of becoming dangerous in this valley." "I am not afraid of threats from cowards who burn buildings in the dark rather than face their enemies honestly," Theresa said, her voice steady and cold as winter ice. "You tell Silas Rourke that if he wants this land, he will have to do better than threats and arson. This forge will stand, and it will stand stronger than before, and no amount of intimidation will change that." Something flickered in Crawford's expression, perhaps surprise at the fierce defiance from a woman he had expected to cower before his implied threats, and for a moment, tension crackled in the air like the electricity before a summer storm. "Bold words," Crawford finally said, "for someone with so much to lose." "I have already lost everything I feared losing," Theresa said, and something in her voice suggested she spoke from genuine experience rather than mere bravado. "There is nothing left in me for men like you to threaten with. Now leave this property before I decide that shooting trespassers is easier than arguing with them." The threat, delivered with such calm certainty, apparently convinced Crawford that pressing further would prove unwise. With a final glare at Jedediah, the 3 riders turned and departed, leaving behind an uneasy silence that stretched long after their hoofbeats had faded into the distance. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Jedediah finally said, turning to look at Theresa with new appreciation mixed with concern. "Perhaps both," Theresa admitted, though her hands, Jedediah noticed, trembled slightly now that the confrontation had passed. "I have learned that men like Rourke and his hired thugs respect only strength, Jedediah. Show them fear, and they will exploit it mercilessly. Show them you will not be moved, and sometimes that is enough to make them reconsider their approach." "You speak as though from experience," Jedediah observed carefully. Theresa's expression closed again, that familiar shuddering of emotion that told Jedediah he had once again approached territory she was not ready to share. "Some experiences teach harder lessons than others," was all she said, before turning back to their evening work as though the confrontation had never occurred. But Jedediah could not so easily dismiss what he had witnessed. The fierce courage Theresa had displayed, standing between him and armed threats without hesitation, spoke of a woman who had faced danger before and learned to master her fear rather than let it master her. He found himself wondering again about the mysterious husband, about the fever that had supposedly claimed him, about what other secrets lay buried in Theresa Ramsey's carefully guarded past. That night, after Theresa had departed for her own homestead, Jedediah sat alone amid the skeleton of his rebuilding forge, staring up at the star-scattered sky, and admitted to himself something he had been avoiding acknowledging for days. He was falling in love with Theresa Ramsey, falling in love with her strength and her intelligence and her fierce independence, falling in love with a woman who had shown up in his darkest hour and refused to let him remain broken. The realization terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. He had watched his own father struggle after his mother's death, had seen how deeply love could wound when circumstances tore it away, and he had told himself he would guard his heart more carefully than that, would never allow himself to become so dependent on another person's presence in his life. Yet here he was, already unable to imagine the coming days without Theresa's presence beside him, already anticipating tomorrow's work not merely for the forge's progress, but for the chance to see her again, to work alongside her, to catch glimpses of the vulnerability she guarded so carefully beneath her fierce independence. He did not know if she felt anything similar toward him, could not tell if her fierce defense of his interests stemmed from genuine feeling or merely her general opposition to men like Rourke, who used power to crush those weaker than themselves. But he knew, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, that whatever happened between them, he could not simply return to the solitary existence he had known before the fire had brought Theresa Ramsey into his life. The weeks that followed brought both progress on the forge and deepening complexity to the relationship growing between Jedediah and Theresa. The new walls rose steadily, stronger and better designed than the original structure, and word spread through the valley about the remarkable partnership that had emerged from the ashes of Rourke's attempted intimidation. Some in town, particularly the church-going women who valued propriety above all else, continued to whisper about the impropriety of Theresa spending so much time alone with a bachelor blacksmith. But others, including several of the more established ranching families who had suffered their own dealings with Rourke's aggressive expansion, began to see in their partnership a symbol of resistance against the mining syndicate's attempts to control the valley. "You are becoming something of a local hero," Jedediah told Theresa one afternoon, watching as she precisely measured and marked a beam for cutting. "The widow Hutchins told me yesterday that she thinks you might be the bravest woman in the territory." Theresa's mouth quirked in something between amusement and discomfort. "I'm not trying to be brave, Jedediah. I'm simply trying to do what is right, and to help a neighbor who deserves better than what Rourke has tried to do to him." "Is that all this is to you?" Jedediah asked, an uncharacteristic vulnerability entering his voice. "Simple neighborly duty." Theresa's hands stilled on the beam she was marking, and for a long moment she did not answer, staring at the wood grain as though it might provide guidance for a response she was not certain how to give. "No," she finally admitted, her voice quiet but clear. "It stopped being simple neighborly duty some time ago, though I have been reluctant to examine too closely what it has become instead." The admission hung between them, charged with possibility, and Jedediah found himself moving closer without conscious decision, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice, so different from her usual fierce confidence. "Theresa," he said softly, "I need to know. What happened to you before you came to this valley? What taught you to guard your heart so carefully, even while you fight so fiercely for others?" For a long moment, Theresa said nothing, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, seeing perhaps not the half-built forge before her but memories from years past that still held power over her despite the years that had passed. "My husband," she finally said, the word coming out strained, "did not die of fever, Jedediah. That is the story I tell because the truth is uglier and harder to explain to strangers who have not earned the right to understand it." "You do not have to tell me if you are not ready," Jedediah said, though everything in him wanted to know, wanted to understand this complicated woman more fully. "I think I need to tell someone," Theresa said, surprising him. "I have carried this alone for 3 years, and perhaps that is part of why I have kept everyone at such distance since arriving in this valley. Perhaps it is time to let someone else carry some of this weight." She set down her tools and settled onto a nearby stack of lumber, gesturing for Jedediah to join her. He did, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, offering silent support as she gathered courage to share whatever painful truth she had kept hidden for so long. "His name was Thomas Ramsey," she began, "and when I married him, I believed I had found a partner who valued the same things my father had valued in me. He seemed to admire my skills, my independence, my refusal to be merely decorative in the way so many men expected wives to be. But he changed," Jedediah guessed, watching pain flicker across her face. "He changed," Theresa confirmed, "or perhaps he had always been that way and simply hid it well during our courtship. Once we were married, once he believed he had secured me as his property in the eyes of law and society, his true nature emerged. He began to resent my skills, my capabilities, everything he had once claimed to admire. He wanted a wife who depended entirely on him, who had no capabilities that might make her feel she did not need him." Jedediah felt anger building in his chest at the implications of what she was describing, though he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "He began to control everything," Theresa continued, her voice growing harder as she spoke. "What I could do, who I could see, even how I spent my time. When I resisted, when I insisted on maintaining some independence, he became violent. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, in ways that isolated me from anyone who might have helped, in ways that made me doubt my own judgment about what was reasonable and what was not." "He hurt you," Jedediah said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury on her behalf. "Many times," Theresa confirmed. "But the final time, when I finally understood I had to leave or die trying to survive that marriage, he made the mistake of threatening me with a knife during one of his rages. I had learned self-defense from my father alongside carpentry, understanding that a woman working alone sometimes needed to protect herself. I disarmed him, and in the struggle that followed, he fell against the hearthstones and struck his head." She paused, her hands trembling now as she relived the memory. "He died from that fall, Jedediah. I did not intend to kill him, but I have carried that death with me every day since, wondering if I could have handled the situation differently, wondering if the law would have believed my account if I had stayed to explain what happened rather than fleeing west with what little I could carry." "You did what you had to do to survive," Jedediah said firmly. "No one could blame you for defending yourself against a violent man." "The law in Missouri might have seen it differently," Theresa said. "A wife who kills her husband, regardless of circumstances, faces suspicion that a stranger defending themselves would not face. I could not risk trusting a system that has historically favored men's word over women's, especially in matters of marriage and violence within it. So I fled, changed nothing about my name since Ramsey was common enough not to draw attention, and built a new life here where no one knew my history, where I could be judged by my actions rather than my past. The story explained so much that Jedediah had wondered about: the fierce independence, the careful guarding of her heart, the steel determination that had first drawn his attention when she had refused to be intimidated by Rourke's hired men. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Jedediah said quietly. "I understand now why you have kept such careful distance from forming new attachments. I understand why you fight so fiercely against men who use power and threats to control others, why you could not simply watch Rourke destroy my life without stepping in to help." "It is more than that," Theresa admitted, meeting his eyes directly now, some of her characteristic courage returning even as she revealed this vulnerable truth. "When I saw you kneeling in the ashes of your forge, so broken by loss, I recognized something of my own experience with devastating loss. But more than that, Jedediah, I have watched you these past weeks, and you are nothing like Thomas. You value my capabilities rather than resenting them. You treat me as an equal partner rather than property to be controlled." I did not expect to find such qualities in another man, and I confess, it has made me reconsider whether I truly wanted to remain alone forever, or whether I simply feared repeating past mistakes. Something warm and hopeful bloomed in Jedediah's chest at her admission, and he reached out slowly, giving her ample opportunity to pull away if she wished, to take her hand in his own. "I could never resent your capabilities, Theresa," he said softly. "I find myself in awe of them, actually. I have never met anyone, man or woman, who combines such intelligence with such fierce protective courage. You are remarkable, and I would be honored if you would consider allowing me to court you properly, once this forge stands complete and Rourke's threat has been dealt with." Theresa's fingers curled around his, accepting the connection he offered, and something in her carefully guarded eyes softened into an expression of tentative hope that made Jedediah's heart ache with tenderness. "I would like that," she said quietly. "Though I confess, Jedediah, courtship feels like unfamiliar territory after everything I have survived. I may need patience as I learn to trust again. You have shown remarkable patience helping me rebuild what Rourke tried to destroy," Jedediah said. "I can offer no less in return for as long as you need." The moment stretched between them, charged with new possibility, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats once again interrupted their private conversation. This time, however, the rider proved to be Sheriff Blackwood, his expression grim as he reined in beside the construction site. "I have news you both need to hear," the sheriff said without preamble. "Rourke has filed papers with the territorial court, claiming that Jedediah's original land grant contains an error that invalidates his claim to the water rights specifically. If the court rules in Rourke's favor, he could seize control of the spring regardless of who technically owns the surrounding land." "That is preposterous," Jedediah said, rising to his feet with anger evident in every line of his body. "My father's claim was properly filed and recorded 30 years ago. Rourke has lawyers claiming otherwise," the sheriff said. "There is a hearing scheduled in 3 weeks' time in Prescott. You will need to prove the validity of your claim, or risk losing access to that water regardless of who owns this land." The news landed like another blow after so much progress had been made rebuilding the forge, and Jedediah felt some of his earlier despair threatening to resurface at this new obstacle placed in his path by Rourke's seemingly endless resources. "We will need the original land grant documents," Theresa said, her mind already working through the problem with the same methodical efficiency she brought to construction challenges. "And any records showing continuous use of the water rights since your father's original claim. Jedediah, where would such documents be kept?" "My father kept important papers in a strongbox," Jedediah said, But that strongbox was in the forge office when the fire started. I have not had courage to search through the ashes to see what survived. Then we search today, Theresa said decisively, before Rourke's lawyers can claim the evidence was destroyed along with everything else. They spent the remainder of that day carefully sifting through the ashes of the original forge office, a task made more bearable by working together rather than facing the painful excavation alone. Theresa's methodical approach proved invaluable, as she organized their search by section, ensuring no area was overlooked despite the emotional difficulty of the task. Their persistence was rewarded as afternoon light began to fade, when Theresa's careful digging revealed the corner of a metal strongbox, its exterior blackened by fire, but its contents potentially protected by the very iron that had made it heavy enough to resist complete destruction. "Here," she called out, and Jedediah rushed to help her excavate the box fully, both their hearts pounding with hope as they worked to free it from the ash and debris that had partially buried it. The box proved locked, its key presumably lost in the fire along with so much else, but Theresa produced from her own tool kit a set of picks that spoke of skills beyond mere carpentry. "Where did you learn to pick locks?" Jedediah asked, genuinely startled by this new evidence of her capabilities. "My father again," Theresa said, working the picks with practiced precision. "He believed a person should never be helpless when locked out of their own property, whether by lost keys or malicious intent. He taught me many skills that proper society considers inappropriate for a woman, and I have found each one valuable in turn." The lock yielded to her efforts, and inside, protected from the worst of the fire's heat by the metal casing, they found a collection of papers, singed at the edges but largely legible, including what appeared to be the original land grant documentation, along with years of tax records and water usage documentation that clearly established the Quinn family's continuous claim to both the land and its crucial water rights. "This should be more than sufficient to prove your claim," Theresa said, carefully reviewing the documents with an eye for detail that suggested experience beyond mere carpentry and homesteading. "Rourke's lawyers will have a difficult time arguing against such comprehensive documentation." "Theresa," Jedediah said, watching her work through the papers with obvious expertise, "how do you know so much about legal documentation and land claims?" Theresa looked up, and something in her expression suggested she had perhaps revealed more of her capabilities than she had intended. "My father's shipbuilding business required extensive contract work and legal documentation. I helped him manage those affairs alongside learning carpentry, since he trusted my judgment more than he trusted the clerks he might have hired instead. It seems those skills have proven useful in unexpected ways here as well." The revelation of yet another hidden capability left Jedediah feeling a mixture of awe and something approaching wonder at the depths of skill and knowledge this remarkable woman possessed. Every day seemed to reveal new evidence that Theresa Ramsey was far more than the simple homesteader woman the valley had assumed her to be. "You continue to surprise me," Jedediah said, and Theresa's cheeks colored slightly at the evident admiration in his voice. "I have had to develop many skills to survive alone," she said, though something in her tone suggested she was pleased rather than merely deflecting his compliment. "Skills that society tells women they should not need, but which have served me well nonetheless." With the crucial documents secured, they turned their attention to preparing for the upcoming hearing, though this preparation had to proceed alongside the continuing work of rebuilding the forge, since abandoning that project now would suggest to Rourke and his allies that his intimidation tactics were succeeding. The 3 weeks that followed proved among the most intense of Jedediah's life, filled with long days of physical labor on the forge, combined with evening hours spent reviewing legal documents and preparing arguments for the water rights hearing. Theresa proved invaluable throughout this process, her methodical mind cutting through complex legal language to identify the strongest arguments for defending Jedediah's claim. Their partnership deepened during these weeks, evolving from the careful professional distance of their early collaboration into something warmer and more intimate, though both remained cautious about moving too quickly given Theresa's painful history with trust and vulnerability in relationships. They shared meals together as the workday ended, Theresa often bringing food from her own homestead to supplement whatever simple provisions Jedediah managed to prepare. They talked long into evening hours about topics far beyond forge construction or legal strategy, sharing dreams and fears and hopes that neither had voiced to another living soul in years. Jedediah learned that Theresa dreamed of eventually establishing a proper carpentry business, teaching other women the skills her father had taught her, breaking down the barriers that assumed such trades belonged exclusively to men. Theresa learned that Jedediah harbored dreams beyond mere blacksmithing, imagining a day when his forge might supply not just horseshoes and tool repair, but finer ironwork, artistic pieces that combined function with beauty in ways his father had never attempted. "You should pursue that dream," Theresa told him one evening, examining a decorative iron gate hinge he had crafted during a rare quiet moment, its design incorporating flowing botanical patterns that revealed genuine artistic sensibility beneath his practical skills. "This is beautiful work, Jedediah. There is a market for such craftsmanship, especially as the territory grows more settled and prosperous families seek to demonstrate their status through fine ironwork. Perhaps once the forge is complete and this legal matter with Rourke is settled," Jedediah said, though something in his voice suggested the dream felt more possible now than it had before Theresa's encouragement. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the valley's residents, and gossip continued to swirl about the exact nature of their relationship. Some speculated they were already secretly engaged, others whispered scandalous theories about impropriety, but Jedediah found himself caring less each day about such speculation, focused instead on the genuine connection deepening between himself and this remarkable woman who had transformed his darkest hour into an unexpected opportunity for growth and love. The night before the scheduled hearing in Prescott, Jedediah found himself unable to sleep, anxiety about the legal proceedings mixing with deeper anxieties about his growing feelings for Theresa and uncertainty about how to properly express them without frightening away someone who had suffered so much from a previous relationship's controlling nature. He found her still working at the forge site well after dark, reviewing legal documents by lantern light with an intensity that suggested she shared his own anxious inability to rest. "You should sleep," he told her, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks before in the ashes of his despair. "We have a long ride to Prescott tomorrow, and you will need your wits about you for the hearing." "I could say the same to you," Theresa replied, though she set down the papers she had been reviewing. "I confess, Jedediah, I find myself more anxious about tomorrow's outcome than I have admitted." "We have strong documentation," Jedediah said. "The claim should hold regardless of whatever arguments Rourke's lawyers attempt." "It is not merely the legal outcome that concerns me," Theresa admitted, and something vulnerable entered her voice that drew Jedediah closer despite his own uncertainty. "I find myself thinking about what happens after, regardless of how the hearing concludes. The forge will soon be complete. Our reason for spending each day together will end. I find myself uncertain what that means for what has grown between us these past weeks." The admission mirrored Jedediah's own anxious thoughts precisely, and he felt something settle in his chest, a certainty that had been building for days finally crystallizing into clear resolve. "Theresa," he said, taking her hands in his own, "what has grown between us does not depend on the forge's construction schedule. I love you, not merely for your remarkable skills or your fierce courage, though I admire both deeply. I love you for who you are, for the way you have shown me that vulnerability and strength can coexist, that trusting someone again is possible even after devastating betrayal. Whatever happens tomorrow with the hearing, I want to continue building a life alongside you, if you will have me." Theresa's eyes shone with unshed tears in the lantern light, and for a moment, Jedediah feared he had moved too quickly, revealed too much before she was ready to hear it. But then she was moving toward him, closing the distance between them, and her lips met his in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than any words could have expressed of feelings too long suppressed by caution and past pain. "I love you too," she whispered when they finally parted, her forehead resting against his. "I did not expect to find love again, Jedediah Quinn, especially not so soon after everything I survived with Thomas. But you have shown me that not all men seek to control or diminish a woman's strength. You have shown me that a partnership between equals is possible, is even more powerful than the solitary independence I convinced myself was sufficient for happiness." They stood together in the moonlight, the skeleton of the rebuilding forge surrounding them like a monument to their growing partnership, and Jedediah felt more hopeful about the future than he had since watching his father's legacy burn to ashes just weeks before. The hearing the following day proved both stressful and ultimately triumphant. Rourke's lawyers presented their arguments with practiced sophistication, attempting to twist minor technical language in the original land grant into grounds for challenging Jedediah's claim to the water rights. But Theresa's careful preparation and organization of the surviving documentation proved decisive, presenting a clear and compelling case that left the presiding judge little room for interpretation favorable to Rourke's position. "The claim stands as originally filed," the judge ruled, to visible frustration from Rourke's legal team and barely restrained joy from Jedediah and Theresa. "Mr. Quinn's water rights remain intact and undisputed. This matter is settled." Outside the courthouse, as they prepared for the long ride back to Prescott Valley, Rourke himself approached them, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious sting of defeat. "You have won this round," he said, addressing Jedediah directly while barely glancing at Theresa, a dismissiveness that made her bristle with barely contained irritation. "But do not think this matter is finished. I have other means of achieving my objectives in that valley." "Try whatever tactics you wish, Mr. Rourke," Theresa said, stepping forward with the same fierce confidence she had displayed weeks before facing his hired thugs. "You will find that Jedediah Quinn is no longer standing alone against your schemes, and I promise you, I am considerably more difficult to intimidate than you might expect from a woman." Rourke's eyes narrowed as he finally gave Theresa his full attention, something calculating entering his expression as though reassessing an opponent he had previously dismissed as insignificant. "You are quite the fierce advocate for your neighbor's interests, Miss Ramsey. One wonders what personal stake you have in his success." "My personal stake," Theresa said clearly, "is that I intend to marry Jedediah Quinn, making his interests my own in every sense that matters. Whatever schemes you continue to pursue against this valley, you will find us united against you, and I promise that union makes us considerably stronger than either of us was alone." The declaration, delivered with such public confidence, left Jedediah momentarily speechless with surprise and joy, while Rourke's expression shifted to something approaching genuine concern for the first time since they had known him. "Well," Rourke finally said, recovering his composure, "congratulations seem in order then, though I would advise you both to remember that my resources extend far beyond legal challenges and hired intimidation. This valley's future remains far from decided." With that ominous parting statement, Rourke departed, leaving Jedediah and Theresa standing together outside the Prescott courthouse, the morning's legal victory now overshadowed by Theresa's public declaration of their engagement. "Did you mean that?" Jedediah asked once Rourke was safely out of earshot, hardly daring to hope that her words had been more than a strategic display of unity against their common enemy. "Every word," Theresa said, though a slight uncertainty had crept into her confident demeanor now that the immediate confrontation had passed. "I apologize for making such an announcement without first discussing it privately with you." but something about Rourke's dismissive attitude toward my involvement made me want to make our commitment absolutely clear, to him and to anyone else who might doubt the strength of what we have built together. I could not have wished for a more perfect way to hear such news, Jedediah said, pulling her into an embrace that drew curious glances from passers-by on the busy Prescott Street, but which neither of them cared to notice or acknowledge. Theresa Ramsey, will you truly marry me? Not merely as strategic response to Rourke's schemes, but because you love me as I love you. Yes, Theresa said, her earlier uncertainty melting into genuine joy. Yes, Jedediah Quinn, I will marry you, and I will love you for the rest of my days, and together we will build not just your forge but a life stronger than anything Rourke or anyone else could hope to tear down. Their engagement, however joyfully embraced, could not entirely dispel the shadow of Rourke's continued threats, and the weeks following their return to Prescott Valley proved that his warning had not been merely empty bluster. Strange incidents began plaguing both the forge construction and Theresa's own homestead. Minor sabotage that could not be definitively traced to Rourke's men, but which followed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. A fence line at Theresa's property was found cut one morning, allowing her small herd of cattle to wander dangerously close to a ravine before she managed to round them up. Lumber destined for the forge construction was discovered damaged by what appeared to be deliberate exposure to moisture, warping boards that had been carefully seasoned for months. Small fires were reported near both properties, quickly extinguished before causing serious damage, but clearly intended as warnings of Rourke's continued campaign against them. He is trying to wear us down, Jedediah said one evening, frustration evident in his voice as they discussed the latest incident, a poisoned water trough that had sickened two of Theresa's goats before she identified the contamination. Death by 1,000 small cuts, since he cannot defeat us through legal or violent means directly. Then we must be smarter than his schemes, Theresa said, though weariness had begun creeping into her usual fierce determination after weeks of dealing with constant low-level harassment. We need evidence connecting these incidents directly to Rourke or his men, evidence strong enough to bring proper legal charges rather than merely defending against his schemes reactively. How do you propose we gather such evidence? Jedediah asked. His men are careful never to be seen directly, striking only when we cannot catch them in the act. Theresa's expression sharpened with sudden inspiration, the kind of calculating intelligence that Jedediah had come to recognize as preceding one of her most effective strategic insights. Perhaps we need to make ourselves appear more vulnerable than we actually are, drawing them into a trap of our own making rather than merely reacting to their schemes. The plan Theresa developed over the following days combined her strategic thinking with practical skills from both their backgrounds, creating an elaborate scheme to catch Rourke's men in the act of sabotage, providing evidence solid enough to force legal consequences for their campaign of harassment. They spread word through the valley, carefully calculated to reach Rourke's ears through his network of informants, that Jedediah's forge construction was falling behind schedule due to financial difficulties, that he might be forced to sell after all if circumstances did not improve soon. This false vulnerability, they hoped, would encourage Rourke's men to attempt a more significant act of sabotage, believing the couple's resistance was finally weakening. Meanwhile, Theresa arranged with several trusted neighbors, families who had suffered their own difficulties with Rourke's aggressive expansion tactics, to establish a network of hidden observation posts around both properties, ready to witness and document any suspicious activity. The trap, when it finally sprung, proved more dramatic than either had anticipated. 10 days after spreading their false information, in the deep hours of night, 3 of Rourke's men approached the nearly completed forge structure carrying what appeared to be materials for arson, clearly intending to finish what their earlier fire had failed to accomplish. But Theresa and Jedediah, along with 2 trusted neighbors serving as witnesses, were waiting in concealment, having anticipated exactly such an escalation given the pattern of Rourke's previous tactics. "Hold there," Jedediah called out as the men approached the forge with their incendiary materials, emerging from concealment with rifle raised, while Theresa and their neighbor witnesses provided additional coverage from other angles. The would-be arsonists froze, clearly startled by the ambush, and in the chaos that followed, one attempted to flee while the other two, recognizing the futility of resistance against multiple armed opponents, surrendered rather than risk violence. "You are caught in the act of attempted arson," Theresa said, her voice carrying clear authority as she stepped forward with a lantern to illuminate the scene clearly enough for their witnesses to identify the men positively. "We have witnesses to testify to exactly what we have seen here tonight, and this time, Silas Rourke will not escape consequences for his campaign of terror against this valley." The captured men, faced with clear evidence of their crime and the presence of multiple witnesses, quickly began implicating Rourke directly in exchange for leniency in their own prosecution, providing the sheriff with exactly the evidence needed to finally bring formal charges against the mining syndicate's owner for his campaign of intimidation and property destruction. The subsequent trial, held in Prescott 2 months later, proved a decisive victory not just for Jedediah and Theresa, but for the entire valley, as other victims of Rourke's aggressive tactics came forward once his vulnerability to prosecution became evident, providing additional testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic intimidation and property destruction across multiple homesteads and businesses. Rourke, facing overwhelming evidence and mounting legal costs, ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included substantial financial penalties, mandatory departure from the territory, and formal relinquishment of any claims to land or water rights he had attempted to acquire through improper means throughout the valley. "It is over," Jedediah said, standing beside Theresa outside the Prescott courthouse as they watched Rourke depart under guard, his mining syndicate's local operations effectively dissolved by the legal proceedings and their damaging revelations. "We have won, Theresa. The valley is finally free of his threats." "We have won," Theresa agreed, taking his hand in celebration of their shared triumph. "Now we can focus on building our life together, without the shadow of his schemes hanging over everything we hope to accomplish." Their wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a bright autumn afternoon that seemed to reflect the joy and hope both had found after their respective struggles with past trauma and present threats. The ceremony was held at the newly completed forge, its rebuilt walls standing stronger and more beautiful than the original structure, decorated for the occasion with autumn flowers that Theresa had grown in her own garden. The entire valley seemed to turn out for the celebration, a testament to how thoroughly their story had captured the community's imagination and admiration. Even those who had initially whispered about impropriety now celebrated openly, recognizing in Theresa and Jedediah's partnership something worth honoring rather than criticizing. Reverend Whitfield, who had come to know both Jedediah and Theresa well through the community's small congregation, presided over the ceremony with evident personal joy at witnessing their union. "We gather today," he began, "to celebrate a love born from adversity, strengthened by shared struggle, and proven true through trials that would have broken lesser partnerships. Jedediah Quinn and Theresa Ramsey have shown this valley what true partnership means, how strength combined with strength creates something far more powerful than either could achieve alone." As they exchanged vows before their assembled community, both Jedediah and Theresa felt the weight of their difficult pasts finally lifting, replaced by hope for a future built on mutual respect, shared strength, and genuine love that honored rather than diminished each partner's unique capabilities. "I, Jedediah Quinn, take you, Theresa Ramsey, as my wife," Jedediah said, his voice steady with conviction despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I promise to value your strength as much as I value my own, to support your dreams as fiercely as you have supported mine, and to build alongside you a partnership where neither of us must sacrifice our true selves for the other's comfort or convenience. I, Theresa Ramsey, take you, Jedediah Quinn, as my husband, Theresa responded, her own voice carrying the particular strength that had first drawn Jedediah's admiration weeks before. I promise to trust in this partnership as I once feared trusting any man, to build with you not just this forge but a life where both our capabilities are honored equally, and to love you with the same fierce dedication I have brought to every challenge I have faced. The kiss that sealed their vows drew cheers from the assembled crowd, and as they turned to face their community as husband and wife, both felt the profound truth in Reverend Whitfield's words. Their love had indeed been born from adversity, tested by trials that might have destroyed a less genuine connection, but emerged stronger for having weathered those challenges together rather than apart. The wedding celebration continued long into the evening, with music and dancing and abundant food provided by neighbors who had come to genuinely respect and admire the couple's journey from strangers brought together by tragedy into partners bound by deep, authentic love. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing for their own homes, Jedediah found a quiet moment to speak privately with his new wife. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, watching moonlight play across her features as they stood together near the forge that had brought them together. "About everything that led us here, the pain of the fire, the challenges we faced with Rourke, even the painful memories you shared from your past." Theresa considered the question seriously, as she considered everything, before answering with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I regret the pain that Thomas caused me, and I regret that your father's forge had to burn before we found each other. But I cannot regret the path that led us to this moment, Jedediah. Every difficulty we faced taught me something about my own strength, and more importantly, showed me that genuine partnership with someone who respects that strength is possible. I would not trade this happiness for a life without the struggles that led us here, because those struggles shaped both of us into the people who could recognize and value what we have built together." "I feel the same," Jedediah said, pulling her close against the cool evening air. "The fire took my father's forge, but it gave me you, Theresa. And I would rebuild that forge 1,000 times over if it meant finding my way to this moment, standing here with you as my wife, ready to build a future together that neither of us could have imagined possible before that terrible night." Their life together in the years that followed proved as remarkable as the circumstances that had brought them together. The forge, rebuilt stronger and more efficient than ever, flourished under Jedediah's expanded ambitions, incorporating the artistic ironwork that Theresa had encouraged him to pursue alongside practical blacksmithing services. Word of his craftsmanship spread beyond the valley, attracting customers from as far as Phoenix and Tucson who sought decorative gates, fine tools, and custom metalwork that demonstrated both function and beauty. Theresa, meanwhile, established the carpentry business she had dreamed of, eventually taking on apprentices, including several young women from the valley who had watched her remarkable skills with growing admiration and wished to learn similar trades themselves. Her reputation for quality craftsmanship, combined with her willingness to teach skills traditionally reserved for men, made her something of a local legend, inspiring other women throughout the territory to pursue capabilities beyond society's narrow expectations. 2 years into their marriage, Theresa gave birth to their first child, a son they named William after Jedediah's father, whose forged legacy had ultimately led to this unexpected but profound happiness. The boy grew quickly, showing early interest in both his father's blacksmithing work and his mother's carpentry skills, spending hours in both workshops observing his parents' craftsmanship with fascinated attention. 3 years after William's birth, their family expanded further with the arrival of a daughter, whom they named Sarah after Theresa's own mother, who had died when Theresa was young but whose memory Theresa had always cherished despite the passage of years. Sarah proved to have her mother's fierce independence from an early age, showing no hesitation in following her older brother into whatever adventures the forge and workshop offered, refusing to be excluded from activities simply because society might deem them inappropriate for a young girl. The valley itself flourished in the years following Rourke's departure, freed from the constant threat of his aggressive expansion tactics, and able to develop according to the genuine needs and desires of its established community, rather than external commercial interests seeking to exploit its resources. New families arrived, drawn by stories of the community's strength and resilience, and Prescott Valley gradually transformed from a struggling frontier settlement into a thriving agricultural and craft community known throughout the territory for both its natural beauty and its skilled artisans. Jedediah and Theresa's forge became something of a landmark, not merely for the quality craftsmanship it produced, but for the story of its rebuilding, a testament to resilience and partnership that visitors often ask to hear when passing through the valley. Neither Jedediah nor Theresa ever tired of sharing that story, though they always emphasized that the true value lay not in the dramatic circumstances of their meeting, but in the deep, genuine partnership they had built together in the years that followed. On the 10th anniversary of the fire that had brought them together, Jedediah and Theresa stood once again amid the forge that now stood as testament to their shared strength, watching their two children play in the autumn afternoon light, while they reflected on the remarkable journey that had led them to this moment of profound happiness. "Do you remember," Theresa asked, "how frightened you were that first morning, kneeling in the ashes, certain that everything worthwhile in your life had been destroyed?" "I remember," Jedediah confirmed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they watched their children's joyful play. "I could not have imagined in that moment of devastating loss that I was actually witnessing the beginning of something far more valuable than anything Rourke's fire could destroy. You showed me that morning, and every day since, that true strength lies not in avoiding vulnerability, but in facing it with courage and finding partnership with someone who honors rather than exploits that vulnerability." "And you showed me," Theresa replied, "that trust could be rebuilt, that love could exist without the control and fear I had experienced with Thomas. Together, we built something neither of us could have created alone, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for each other's capabilities." Their son William, now 8 years old and already showing remarkable aptitude for blacksmithing under his father's careful instruction, called out to them from where he was helping his younger sister construct an elaborate fort from scrap lumber, Sarah directing the construction with confidence that clearly echoed her mother's natural leadership abilities. "Mother, father, come see what we have built." Jedediah and Theresa exchanged a smile filled with the profound contentment of two people who had found in each other exactly the partnership their hearts had needed, before walking together to admire their children's creation, their own hands still bearing the calluses and scars of their respective crafts, their love for each other only deepened by the years and challenges they had faced together since that terrible night when fire had first brought them together. The forge that Silas Rourke had tried to destroy stood not merely rebuilt, but transformed, its walls housing not just the practical business of blacksmithing, but the deeper legacy of a love story that had taught an entire valley about resilience, partnership, and the profound strength that could emerge when two capable, independent souls chose to build their lives together rather than remaining isolated in their individual struggles. As autumn light faded into evening, and the family gathered for their evening meal in the home Jedediah and Theresa had built together beside the forge, both felt profound gratitude for the journey that had led them to this moment of complete happiness. The fire that had destroyed Jedediah's forge had, in its devastating aftermath, illuminated a path toward love neither had believed possible, proving that sometimes our greatest tragedies become the foundation for our most profound joy, when met with courage, resilience, and the willingness to build something new from the ashes of what came before. Their story became legend throughout the territory, told and retold as an example of what genuine partnership could accomplish. How a homesteader woman's remarkable skills and fierce independence had not merely helped rebuild a blacksmith's forge, but had rebuilt his entire life, his faith in love, and his understanding of what true strength meant when shared between equals who valued rather than feared each other's capabilities. In the years that followed, as their children grew and eventually established their own families within the thriving valley community, Jedediah and Theresa remained the same devoted partners they had become during those crucial weeks of rebuilding after the fire. Their love, tested by fire and threat and painful revelations from difficult pasts, had proven strong enough to weather every challenge, emerging not merely intact but continuously strengthened by shared experience and mutual respect. The forge stands still today, in the valley that Theresa and Jedediah helped transform from a struggling settlement into a thriving community, a physical testament to the truth that from the ashes of devastating loss, something far more beautiful and enduring can emerge, when built upon the solid foundation of genuine love, mutual respect, and the courage to trust again after experiencing profound pain. Their legacy lived on not merely in the physical structures they built, but in the countless lives they touched through their example of partnership. In the young women Theresa taught to value their own capabilities regardless of society's narrow expectations. In the community that learned to stand together against those who would exploit and control rather than build and support. And in quiet moments, when the forge fires burned low and the day's work was complete, Jedediah Quinn would often find himself watching his remarkable wife with the same awe and admiration he had felt that first day, when her fierce determination had refused to let his despair consume him entirely, when her extraordinary skills had begun the process of rebuilding not just a forge, but an entire life, from nothing but ashes and hope and the profound courage to love again. Theresa Ramsey Quinn had indeed rebuilt his life from nothing. But more than that, she had shown him that true partnership between equals, built on mutual respect for each other's unique strengths and capabilities, could create something far more valuable and enduring than either of them could have imagined possible before fire had brought them together on that devastating night that had, in retrospect, marked not an ending but a beginning. The first spark of a love story that would illuminate the rest of their days together, burning steady and true like the forge fires that had first brought them together, and which would continue burning for generations to come.